Hello, I'm Mr. Databrain, and I'll be interviewing Mr. Quack, a historian on Mr. Duck's long cartoon history. The focus of this interview is to discuss the facts surrounding a short starring Mr. Duck, made in 1942, known as The New Spirit and its association with the victory tax. Mr. Quack, thank you for joining us today. Let's get to it. Prior to 1942, do you know approximately how many American households filed federal income tax returns?
Glad I can be of assistance. If my memory serves me, I believe it was no more than 8%. Mr. Duck told me it was even less prior to his starring role. The Treasury Department had shown him a division staff memo from 1941, stating that only 3.9% of the entire American population filed returns in 1936.
Mr. Quack, is it true that after Mr. Duck's exhortations in the short, a lot more American households started sending in payments declared to be of income taxes?
Indeed. Patriotic Americans heard the call of this vague and confusingly worded temporary measure known as the victory tax. Mr. Duck really got the Americans involved, with 38% of households voluntarily complying in 1943.
That is quite a jump, a tenfold increase in approximately 7 years. My hat is off to Mr. Duck. With such success from one cartoon, was he asked to star in yet another?
Ah yes. The Spirit of 43. Mr. Duck spent the first 2.5 minutes trying to decide if he would save his money to pay his taxes. The rest of the short goes into great detail about the taxes every good American supposedly had a duty to pay, or be depicted as friends of Hitler and enemies of liberty and democracy. This of course helped support the employer withholding aspect of this new tax.
Do you think Mr. Duck, or any other average Americans, knew the Victory Tax Act of 1942 was a direct tax on Americans' income, and may have been in violation of Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3 of the U.S. Constitution?
I'm quite sure Mr. Duck didn't know, and if he, or they, had known to ask, the government would most likely have responded it was legitimate, citing Article 1, Section 5, Clause 2 of the Constitution, to support armies, but no apportionment for money to that use shall be a longer term than 2 years.
Given this was a voluntary short-term war tax, didn't anyone ask what was really going on?
Actually, Mr. Disney questioned Mr. Helvering, the Internal Revenue Commissioner, why the government just didn't jail people who did not pay the income tax. Mr. Helvering replied that the government wanted people to be enthusiastic about paying their taxes.
Folks higher up the gravy train had to be involved, else the government would not have engaged Mr. Duck and Mr. Disney to make these two shorts. Mr. Quack, can you help us understand who was driving the gravy train, so to speak?
Certainly. You see, this new tax legislation needed voluntary compliance, and the then Secretary of the Treasury knew this only too well. Hauling Americans off to jail for not paying it would simply not be accepted, and it would have brought about constitutional scrutiny. It was the Secretary's brilliant idea to get Americans to pay by making it their patriotic duty. This is how Mr. Sullivan got the marching orders to get a reluctant Mr. Disney to Washington to discuss Mr. Duck's new role in American patriotism.
Strange they wanted Mr. Disney. Why didn't they just use the radio and some great music?
You must remember there was not TV in the early 40s. However, there was a new way for the government to reach the masses, the movie house. Back then, movies were real popular and Americans went to one nearly every week. The government knew this, and of course they kept Mr. Disney in the dark. Mr. Disney actually arrived in D.C. thinking he was meeting with Mr. Helvering to discuss promoting war bonds. Even then it was smoke and mirrors, if I may use one of your terms.
Mr. Disney and Mr. Duck, the dynamic duo behind the selling of voluntary victory tax. Mr. Quack, if this was a temporary tax, why are we still paying it, long after the war was won?
Quite simple, old boy. It was renewed in 1944 and was to expire when the war was over. However, it was put into the Internal Revenue Code as wage and employment tax, and not the income tax. when the war was over, Washington could not shut down this new gravy train. The public had accepted it, and the Victory Tax Act was never disputed, at least not by any patriotic Americans. The government, Mr. Duck, and Mr. Disney teamed up with the IRS, and the rest is history, as they say.
Mr. Quack, one last question if you please. With all the facts available about this temporary war tax, how is the government keeping this going?
I can assure you that Mr. Duck has had no further part in the ducking of the American people. From what I understand, the government and the lawmakers simply wave the 16th Amendment flag around and start talking in special terms defined in the laws they pass. I am certainly no expert in this area, nor would I wish to be. I have a full-time job keeping up with Mr. Duck's antics.
Mr. Quack, I believe there is an expert in this area, Mr. Peter Hendrickson, author of Cracking the Code, The Fascinating Truth About Taxation in America. I'm sure he will be able to enlighten us regarding these questions, and more. Thank you again for visiting with me, and helping us to learn the truth and the facts hidden behind the income tax curtains, keeping us in the dark, and paying more in taxes than we really owe. In closing, we've learned about voluntary compliance, and its part in the great ducking of the American people, or how a cartoon duck hustled our patriotic grandparents, parents, and us into the income tax mess we have today.